Hi, welcome to this month's video. In this one we're going to look at making mute and solo buttons for our mic mixer. And it's quite a sort of in-depth concept. I've tried to create a mute and solo algorithm a few times, and if you look on my GitHub page you'll actually see some there. And they always end up being about 200 lines of code with a bunch of loops in them. And I've never been really happy. It's not elegantly written. It tends to be a bit buggy. So when I set out to create this video, I sat down and it's taken me about 4 days, and I've come up with the most elegant and simple way of doing this with as few lines of code as possible that I could possibly come up with. And I've tried about 5 or 6 different methods, and as you know with coding, once you see one way of doing something, it's kind of difficult to find another way. And that was the struggle I had. I kept rewriting and I was essentially doing the same thing and coming up against the same problems. So in the end I found a totally different way of doing it to what I'd been doing before, and I got rid of all the loops, and well, actually there's still one loop in there, but I got rid of all the extra loops and I managed to boil it down to something quite simple, and it's only about 60 lines of code. So it's as elegant as I think I can make it. I'll probably revise that in the future at some point and maybe get it down to 50 lines of code, but for now I'm really quite pleased with it. So this is an implementation I'm actually using in one of my projects at the moment, and it's important that we look at how the mic mixer as a whole is structured. And the way I'm doing a mic mixer in HISE is I have 3 simple gain modules, so they represent my 3 mic positions. Obviously if you've got a different number of mic positions you need a different number of gain modules. And then nothing is linked by parameter ID because I need to use the callbacks. So there's no parameter ID stuff. We're doing this all in the script. So these faders control the gain of the simple gain modules. And then the mute button is going to control the gain of the simple gain. And so is the solo button. And we'll look in detail at their configuration in a moment, but I just want to say that's the way I'm doing this. So there are other approaches to this. For example, you could have it when you press the mute button, rather than just turning this dial down over here, it could actually move this fader down. That's an approach I've seen. Another thing you can do is when you press the solo button is, rather than have it just turn these dials down, you can actually have it mute the other channels or turn their faders down. So there are a few approaches to doing this. I've just gone for a kind of simple one. So as I was deciding on how I was going to approach this, I wrote myself a little sort of breakdown. So let's just pull this over here. So this was just my guide to how I was going to approach this. And one of the things I did at first was I tried to literally follow this guide and do it step by step. And I kind of ended up with another really long script that was a bit of a mess and full of bugs. So I, again, sort of boiled it down until I got something that was more simple. So basically in our script we're going to have 3 elements. We've got the mute button, the solo button, and the gain slider, gain knob, whatever control you're using to control that. So the mute button, if the mute button is turned on, then we check if the solo button for that channel is also on. So let's say that solo button is on. So if the mute button is on and the solo button is on, what we need to do is turn off the solo button for the same channel. So we turn it off when we enable the mute button. So that's what happens, it goes off. And then we trigger the solo button's callback. Well, we'll see that in the code. That's what we're doing here, and that's why these 2 knobs here, which are currently set to -100, when we click the mute button, they shoot up to 0. That's because it's triggering the solo button's callback. And that's the off action for the solo button. So I'll turn the mute button off again, and then let's go back to our little breakdown here. So we're still in the mute button, we're still, if the mute button is turned on, we're still in that side of it. And we're saying if no channels are soloed, we've got to make a record of the channel's gain. So if we click the mute button, it's going to set the gain knob over here to -100. But when we turn the mute button back off, we need to know the gain value to restore it to, because it won't necessarily be 0. If the fader's down here, we need to restore it to -12. So to do that, we have to keep a record of the gain value when we enable the mute button. Now previously I was doing this with an array and I was actually storing all the gain values separately, and that was adding to the bulk of my code. And then it occurred to me I don't need to do that because I already have the gain value stored in the slider position. When we get to the code, you'll see that we're just restoring it from the slider position. And then we set the channel's gain to -100 once we've made a record of it. So that's what we're doing, -100. Now if the mute button is turned off and no solo buttons are active, which is the state we've got now, we just restore the value. Obviously if solo buttons are active, then we don't want to restore the value because this solo button is maintaining that channel at -100 whether or not it's muted. So for the solo button, we've got a similar sort of breakdown. We go if the solo button is turned on, we turn off the mute button. So if the mute button's on, it'll be turned off. So it's a toggle. And then we restore the channel's gain. So if it was muted, its gain would be restored. If it isn't muted and we press it, then it's just going to leave it, but it's going to mute the other channels. So the muting of the other channels is this part here. And this is where I used to always end up writing lots of different loops. Okay, so this part gets a little confusing and a little complicated, so I'll try and explain it briefly, and when we get to the code, it'll hopefully make sense. When we turn the solo on, we've got to turn the mute off. We're good with that. But when we turn the solo on or off, it doesn't matter. Either way, we have to check the state of the other channels, and this is why we need loops here. So we're going to loop through each of the channels, and we're going to see if each channel in turn is soloed, or if no channels are soloed, or if the channel is muted, and based on those things we'll set the gain knobs appropriately for each channel. And then the last thing we've got to do is the channel gain slider. So we say if the channel isn't muted, so let's say channel 1 here, we're moving the slider on channel 1. If the channel isn't muted and no channels are soloed, or channels are soloed but this is one of them, then we control the gain knob. So we only control the gain knob if this channel is active, basically. So like if I was to mute it, it's at -100, so moving this slider doesn't affect the gain knob at all until we unmute it, and then it'll jump to whatever position the slider's at. And the same is true if we solo a channel and we move the slider of another channel, that channel isn't going to be updated because it's essentially muted by this channel being soloed. Okay, that's kind of the overview. Hopefully that was clear. If not, hopefully it'll become clear when we get into the code. So we'll make a new project. Our mixer isn't going to look as nice as this one. We're just going to use some basic default controls. So we'll create a new project. I'll just put this on the desktop. And we'll save it there on the desktop. So the first thing we need to do is add a front interface. And then we need to add our 3 simple gain effects for our 3 channels. As I say, if you've got more than 3 channels, then you'll need to add more than 3 gain effects. And these start at 1. We're going to change this so it starts at 0, 1, 2. Okay, and we'll just save that. And over here, I'm going to open the interface. Right, so let's quickly build an interface. So we'll close the API browser for now, close the script editor for now. So we're going to need 3 sliders, 3 knobs for our gain. So we'll call this one KNB gain 0. And let's change the text, gain 0. We'll change the mode to be decibel. And we're good to go with that one. So let's just compile that. And now we'll duplicate this twice. And we'll change the text. And we'll just use these tools up here to align them. Okay, so that's our 3 gain sliders. So now we need 3 mute buttons and 3 solo buttons. So we'll call this btn mute 0. And I don't think we need to change anything else for this, so that's fine. We'll just duplicate that 3 times, or 2 times, so we've got 3 copies. Just align those, keep them all neat. And we're going to duplicate these again. And we're just going to change the text on all three of them to say solo. Can you see it hasn't actually applied the ID to the buttons? That's because I forgot to compile after I made the changes. So I'm just going to put these names in manually. So I'm going down the widget list and I'm pressing F2 to bring up the renaming option. And we'll do the same for the solo buttons. Nope, that should be 2. Done it again. And we'll just make this all neatly align. Okay, and I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to save that. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to have a loop to go around and just grab all of these controls and stick them into 3 different arrays. So we're going to have an array for the gain controls, an array for the mute controls, and an array for the solo controls. So first of all, I'm going to create a constant called num channels. And this is going to be equal to 3 because we've got 3 channels. So change that if you've got more or less channels. Then we're going to create 3 arrays. That should be a const var as well, actually. There we go. 3 arrays, so we'll call this one KNB gain. We're going to have one for the mute buttons and one for the solo buttons. And now we're going to have a loop that goes around and just gathers those controls and puts them inside these arrays. And we're using our num channels constant there. And now we just got to populate the arrays. Content.getComponent. And then the name of the component, so it's going to be KNB gain. And then we're going to concatenate I on the end, so we get the number 0, 1, or 2. And I'll just duplicate that, and this time it's going to be the mute button. So I've highlighted the name there, as you can see. I'm going to press Ctrl D, and that I'm pressing it twice, and that selects both instances. So I can just rename both at the same time then, with this multiple cursor option. And I'll do the same thing for the solo. I'll hit F5 just to make sure that's all worked. I'm going to open the script watch table and we can check that the controls are in there. So far, so good. The next thing we need to do is grab each of our simple gain effects. So we're going to do that in the same loop since we've got 3 effects and we're going to need a loop. We're going to do the same thing. So we'll create another array. We'll call it gain effects. And let me just remember what the name is. So it's simple space gain 0. Okay. And we'll do that at the top here. So we'll say gain fx I equals synth dot get effect. Simple gain. And again, we're going to concatenate I onto the end, which is why I wanted to number these from 0 rather than 1. And that's worked, so that's good. Leave a space there. And the next thing we need to do is create 3 callback functions. We need to have one for the gain knobs, one for the mute buttons, and one for the solo buttons. So rather than creating a separate callback for each control, we're going to share the callbacks between the controls of the same type. So I'll do for the gain knob first. We'll call it on KNB gain control, and it's going to need component and value. So that's the first one. And I'm just going to duplicate this because we're going to do the same thing for the mute, except it's going to be btn mute. And the same thing for the solo. And then all we need to do is assign these functions to the various components. So we're going to do that back up here in our loop. So we're going to do kmb gain I dot set control callback. And then we're going to put in the name of this callback function that we've just created. And we'll do the same for the mute and the same for the solo. We just got to rename them. And I'll hit F5 just to check this is all working. Yeah, that's all fine. So the next thing to do is just to populate these callbacks. We're going to start off with the mute button callback because that's quite simple. So what we need to do, we need to check if the solo button for the channel is on. And if it is, we need to turn it off and trigger the solo button callback. So that's what we had here. If the mute button is turned on and the solo button is turned on, turn off the solo button and trigger the callback. And that's the first thing we're going to do. Actually, the first thing we need to do is find out which mute button triggered the callback. So I'm going to use my little technique that I've shown in several videos to find out which of the buttons in our mute array actually triggered this callback, so we know if it's 0, 1 or 2. So we'll go local index equals btn mute dot index of component. And we'll just print that out just so we can see what's happening. So we'll clear that out. So when I hit the first mute button down here in the console, we're going to see 0. When I hit the second one, we'll see 1. And when I hit the third one, we'll see 2. Now I just realised the text for this second one here isn't correct, so we'll just change that. There we go. Okay, so we know which mute button triggered our callback. So now we can check if its solo button is pressed. So let's say we hit mute button 0. We need to check if solo button 0 is active, and if it is, we need to turn it off. So we'll just do a little if statement here. We'll say if btn solo index, because we want it to be the same channel, dot get value. So that's saying if it's on, that's equivalent to writing that, but we don't need to do that. Then we want to turn it off. Set value 0. If the solo button for channel 0 is active and I now click the mute button for channel 0, it should toggle off that solo button. There we go. And the same for channel 1 and the same for channel 2. Okay, so that's the first part. The next thing we need to do is call the solo button's callback. We need to trigger this callback. So that's easy. We just do btn solo index dot changed. The dot change function will always trigger the control's callback. So we're just saying there to trigger the callback for the appropriate solo button. Right, let's go back to our breakdown, see what's next. So the next part is if there are no channels soloed, we record the channel gain, which we don't have to do because that's saved in the slider value. And then we set the channel to -100. So no, the channels are soloed. We set the gain to -100. But we also need to take note of this. If the mute is turned off and no solo buttons are active, and you'll notice we have no solo buttons there as well, so we've got the same thing, we restore the gain. So how this is actually going to play out, like I say, originally I tried to do it by literally following this and I ended up with a mess of code. We're going to achieve these goals, but we're going to do it in a slightly unintuitive way. First thing we're going to do is we're going to say if the mute button is turned on, mute the channel, set it to -100. So we'll just say if value, so value is what we're getting from here, so we're saying if the button that was pressed, the mute button, if it was turned to the on position, do something. And the thing we're going to do is we're going to set this knob here, or the associated channel, we're going to set it to -100. So we'll go gain fx, and that's referring to our array that we have up here, which contains the effects. index, that refers to the button that triggered the callback. Set attribute, so we're setting an attribute of the simple gain effect. And we can get the attribute just by typing in gainfx index dot gain, and that will give us the number of the gain property. And we can actually find that in this list here if we go to through the module browser and we go down to effects. We've got simple gain, and we can see that gain is 0, so we've typed in gain. If we typed in delay, it will give us 1. If we type width, it will give us 2. If we type balance, it will give us 3. So we've typed gain, so we're going to get the gain property, and we're going to set it to -100. So we can test that now. So if we hit one of these mute buttons, it should turn the associated gain knob to -100. So that works. Obviously we haven't put anything in yet for when we turn them off, but so far so good. And then we're going to need an else. And what we need to check here, because the else is going to be when we turn the button off basically. So if value is when we turn the button on, else is going to be happening once we turn the button off. And what we need to do, we need to check if any of the solo buttons are active. And if they're not active, there's no solo buttons active, then we can restore the value of this knob here. But if some of the channels are soloed, then we don't want to do anything. So we need a way to know if these buttons are soloed. And the way I was doing it before was I had a loop, and I'd go through each channel and I'd find out which ones are soloed. And that would mean putting a loop here and it putting a loop anywhere else where we need to know if the channels are soloed. And that's not a good way of doing it. It adds a bit of overhead, but it's also just ugly code. So we're going to use a simpler method. We'll just have a little placeholder here for now. So we'll just have that for now. Is it soloed with an E or is it soloed like that? How do you spell soloed? I'll leave it with an E. So that's our little placeholder for now. So how are we going to check if a channel is soloed? Any channel. We just need to know if a channel is soloed. What we're going to do is we're going to just basically track every time one of these buttons is clicked, these solo buttons, we're going to have an array that just sort of tracks the values of these. So we're going to make that array now. We'll put it up here. And we're going to call it solo state. And then we're going to skip down to our solo button callback. And just like we did for the mute button, we need to get the index of the button that triggered the callback. So we're going to local index equals btn solo.index of component. And then all we need to do is update solo state with the value of the button. So there's our solo state array. We'll give it the index. And we'll say equals value. Now what this lets us do is, instead of having to do a loop to search through each of these channels to see which buttons are soloed, we can use the contains function. So let me show you that function. So it's this one at the top, and it's under the array class. So it's array.contains, and basically we can just say, does an array contain a value? And if it does, it'll return 1. If it doesn't, it'll return 0. We're able to ask, does our solo state array contain the value 1? And if it does contain the value 1, that means one of our solo buttons must be pressed. Because when a button is pressed, it'll put the value of 1 into our array. If it doesn't contain the value 1, then that means no solo buttons are pressed. So let's do that. Let's go back to our mute callback. We'll add on to this else an if, and we'll say if solo state dot contains 1 equals false, then we're going to restore the gain. So we're just checking here to make sure none of the solo buttons are enabled. And we can actually even condense this code a bit. Instead of having this equals false, we can get rid of that and just put an exclamation mark at the beginning, which means not. It means the opposite of this. It's a logical not. So that will do the same thing. And then we can restore the gain value, which we're getting from this knob here. So we'll just copy that line, but instead of putting -100, we'll put k and b gain index dot get value, and that will give us the value of the knob associated with the mute button. So hopefully, if I've done this right, we should now have a functioning mute button which sets to -100 and restores, and it'll restore it to whatever value the gain knob on our interface has. So if I've set it to -7, and you'll notice it hasn't affected the gain knob over here yet, that's because we haven't coded that part. But if I mute it and restore, it should restore to -7. There we go. And that works for all 3 channels. So a nice, elegant solution, all thanks to this .contains function. Right, I think we'll skip the rest of the solo button for now because that's a little complicated. We're going to do the gain knob, the gain control. So what we've got here is we have to see if the channel isn't muted and no channels are soloed, or if there is one soloed, it's this channel, the channel that we're affecting. Then we set the gain value. So we say, so if it's muted, then we don't do anything. If one of the other channels is soloed, then we don't do anything. But if this channel is soloed or no channels are soloed, then we do something. So again, we're going to need to get the index of the gain knob so we know which channel we're affecting. So same routine as before. And then we're going to write a long if statement. So we're going to say if btn mute index.get value equals 0. So we're saying if it's not muted. Now again, we can condense this. We can get rid of the equals 0 and just put an exclamation mark at the beginning. So if the channel isn't muted and no channels are soloed. So we're going to use that contains thing again. Where is it? So we're going to use this solo state contains thing. So we'll put that in. Solo state.contains 1. And note the exclamation mark at the beginning. So we're saying if the channel isn't muted and no channels are soloed, or, so we'll put 2 pipes for or this channel is soloed, btn solo index dot get value. Then we're going to assign the gain knob's value on our GUI to the gain knob of our simple gain module for whichever channel triggered the callback. So again, that's going to be gain fx index dot set attribute gain fx index dot gain, and this time we're going to assign the gain knob index.getValue. I'll hit F5 on that, so let's see if that works. So if we move these now, it should update the simple gain effects, and that's working fine. If we mute a channel, the gain knob on our GUI will have no effect. That's correct until we unmute, and then it's working again. So that's all working nicely. So now we've completed our mute button, we've completed our gain control, and we've done a little bit inside our solo button, but this is where we have to concentrate now. Let's just put a couple of comments in here so we can see a bit more easily. That's a solo button, mute button, gain knob. I'll add some more comments in here as well before I package this up and put it on Patreon, but that'll do for now, just to make it a bit more visually clear which section is which. Okay, so let's look at what we've got for the solo button. So we say if the solo button is turned on, we have to turn off the mute button. Even, it doesn't matter if it's on or off. If the solo button is on, we just double check that the mute button is off. And we've got here restore the channel's gain. And then we've got loop through every channel, do some stuff. This restore the channel's gain, we're going to do a bit like we merged these 2 sections for the mute button. We're going to merge these 2 sections for the solo button and do it a little unintuitively. But we can do this first section. So if the solo button is turned on, we turn off the mute button. So that's easy enough. We just say if value, that's the value of the button, which we're getting from here. Then we're going to turn off the mute button, btn mute index.setValue 0. So we can test that. So if it's muted, we click solo, it toggles it off. So yeah, these two are now toggling nicely. So now the next thing to do, we've got to loop through every channel. If the channel is soloed or no channels are soloed and the channel isn't muted, so similar to what we had going on with the gain knob, then we set the value of the channel to the gain knob's value. Otherwise, we mute the channel. So basically any channels that aren't soloed and another channel is soloed, we set it to -100. Otherwise, we just let it be soloed. So we can have multiple channels soloed at the same time. So we're going to have a loop here. And we could do I is less than num channels like we did before, but since we're in the solo button callback, we might as well use btn solo.length. So the number of solo buttons. And what we're going to put here is essentially the same function we had for our gain knob, the same if statement, sorry. This one here, we're going to take this if statement and we're going to just copy and paste it straight in there. And just instead of where it says index, because we're in a loop, we're going to change index to be I. So I've highlighted both of those. We'll just change that to be I. So we're saying if the channel I isn't muted and either no channels are soloed or this channel is soloed, then we will set the volume to the gain value of the knob. And again, we'll just copy that from up here. So exactly the same as we had for the gain knob callback. And we'll just change the indexes there to be I. And then we have an else, which is basically the opposite of this. So if the channel is muted or another channel is soloed and this one isn't soloed, we're going to set the value to -100. We're going to essentially mute the channel. So we can type that out, gain fx I.set attribute gain, make sure I've got a capital G there, -100, and I'll just hit F5 here. So that's compiled, and that should be it. That should be our mute and solo functionality. So let's just check that. So soloing works. It is muting the other channels, the channels that are not soloed. But if I solo another one, then that one is also soloed. And if I unsolo the first one, that one's no longer soloed. And if I unsolo all of them, they're all restored. And we can toggle between solo states and mute states. And it restores the value from these knobs up here. So that all seems to be working. So as you can see, it's not a huge script. I said it'd be about 65 lines. So what are we at? We're at 70 lines there, 69 lines. We've got a few comments in and a few bits of white space. So we've got it down to about 65 lines. I can't really see a way to shrink it any further. I'm using as few curly brackets as possible for these if statements. You'll notice that because they're a single line statements, that I'm not using curly braces around them. So I don't think I can get it down any further, but I'd love to get it to about 50 lines of code. But I think this is as streamlined as I can get it. It does mean we have some slightly complex looking if statements, but I mean, we've only really got 2 of them. In fact, we've only really got 1 because this one is the same as this one. So once you get your head around that logic, it's fairly straightforward. Now, I will be putting this code up on Patreon for my Patreon supporters. If you don't follow me on Patreon, you can, there's a link in the video description on YouTube. You can follow me there. This code will be uploaded there, this whole project, along with additional comments within the source code to guide you a bit. And you can take this and just apply it to your own projects. This code is almost identical to the code that I have in that example project I showed you at the beginning, the project I'm working on. I basically just, after I wrote this, I thought that's really great. It's not going to get any better. I just took that and put it straight in my project. I really think this is the best way to do this, or at least the simplest way. But if you do know a better way and you have a solution, perhaps you can get rid of this loop, that would be nice, then do let me know. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below the video. Please click the like button, please click the subscribe button, share the video with anybody you think might be interested in it. I hope this is useful to you, and I'll see you next time.